In December this year, it will be 30 years since the release of the very first PlayStation console. But instead of the god-awful top 10 PlayStation moments videos, which I'm sure all the appallingly dreadful clickbait YouTube channels will churn out, I thought I'd actually do a video with a lot more depth, and unlike most of the Call of Duty babies on YouTube, I actually lived through all this. So this is 30 years of PlayStation, from the superior British perspective. It's easy to believe that Sony just turned up and with zero help just immediately became the biggest gaming brand in the world. But that's not quite right. Three key things happened in the early 90s that allowed the PlayStation to be so effective. The first was Sega showing that Nintendo was not the invincible juggernaut people thought it was. Before the release of the Sega Mega Drive, Nintendo basically had a monopoly in the home console market. One blue hedgehog later though, and Nintendo's iron grip on gaming was shattered. Not that this applied to the UK though, because the NES sold sod all here and we all bought the Sega Master System, but whatever. The second key event was the advent of 3D games in the arcade. You'd sit at home playing fucking Cool Spot or whatever, then you'd go down to the arcade and you'd play Virtua Fighter or Daytona USA, and it just made you wish games at home was good as that. But they weren't. You just had to make do with Wrestle War or some shit like that. In fact, it's well documented that Sega's Virtua Fighter was the key reason for Sony to make the PS1 into a 3D graphics home system. Anyway, the third key event sort of feeds on from this. So the first was there for a system that could actually do 3D graphics at home. The 3DO came out, it was rubbish. The Atari Jaguar came out, it was utter shit. Sega put out the 32X add-on and it was laughable. Every new system claimed to bring 3D graphics home, but bombed because it was nothing like what people had already seen in the arcade. And then when people in the UK first started talking about the PlayStation in 1995, it was basically this.
The Japanese electronics giant Sony is moving into the video games market for the first time. Sony says its new machine is its most important new product since the Walkman personal stereo, but many believe it marks an escalation in the real battle to dominate new technologies in the home.
This move should ensure consumers have a far wider choice of video games equipment than in the past. Sony's PlayStation goes on sale next month for £299. According to industry watchers, this and other new games machines are really extremely powerful low-cost computers with the potential to revolutionise home entertainment.
This was a games console made by Sony. In the mid-90s, Sony made the best TVs, Sony made the best home hi-fis, and everyone had a Walkman or a Discman if you're absolutely loaded. So this isn't some bunch of nobodies like the 3DO or group of has-beens like Atari. This is Sony. These people make all the cool stuff we use all the time, so straight away people are expecting to see something good, because Sony was known for fantastic consumer electronics. But here in the UK, Sega was still very strong, far stronger still than Nintendo, and everyone knew that Sega were releasing the Saturn around the same time as Sony was going to launch the PlayStation. And as much as everyone had respect for Sony, it was Sega that had made all the 3D arcade games we all wanted. I think most people expected the PlayStation to be good, but that the Saturn would be much better. And then the shop displays happened. You saw Virtua Fighter running next to Tekken. It didn't look good for Sega, but the general feeling was that Virtua Fighter was a port of an older game anyway, so it was what it was. Daytona USA versus Ridge Racer on the hand. Holy shit, that was the decider. Daytona USA was the game in the arcade, and to see it looking like that was an embarrassment. It was slow, jerky, and the graphical pop-in looked awful. Ridge Racer, on the other hand, that was the moment that quality 3D arcade-style graphics actually became available at home. This was it. After all the false starts and complete failures of the last few years, finally, 3D home dream was in our hands. And then the killing blow, the PlayStation was £290, a full £100 cheaper than the Saturn. It was a no-brainer, better graphics for a cheaper price. And just like that, Sega's UK stronghold that had stood firm since the Master System had been breached. And it's a little thing, but I remember it being talked about at the time, was that Sega Saturn game cases were gigantic and just looked out of place next to everything on your shelf in this pre-DVD world. PS1 games, on the other hand, were the same size as CD cases, so when you put a PlayStation game on your shelf, it sat nicely in line with your audio CD collection. And it turned out that music in general would be very important to the PS1 in the UK. In the mid-90s, the UK rave scene hit its apex and club culture was gigantic. But one nightclub dwarfed all of them, Ministry of Sound. And to tell you why this was important, here's a little clip from the PlayStation Revolution documentary.
Being a massive youth movement, if you like, in the UK, very much unique globally, that came out of the late 80s kind of rave culture and club culture. By 1994, 1995 was the biggest youth movement in the history of youth tribes. If you put together through the 20th century, all the mods, the rockers, the hippies, the new romantics, the skinheads, every youth movement, it came nowhere near as close as the participants who took part in club culture.
Here we go!
UK dance culture in the 80s saw the birth of the rave scene, and the Ministry of Sound came along in 1991 and was sort of civilised raving, if you like.
Ministry of Sound, I guess, was the best-known club in the UK and globally became a global brand, and that was taken from the big sort of New York warehouse clubbing scene. The Ministry of Sound was the first super club, if you like. But in 1995, they're having a huge refit.
I wouldn't call it upmarket, but it was, we had to remove the gaffer tape and the scaffolding and start to build proper structures, and we built two things. One was an Absolute vodka bar in conjunction with Absolute, but there was another space, and that was where the intrigue and the ideas started, and that saw the birth of the famous PlayStation room at Ministry of Sound.
This PlayStation room, which was kind of just painted black with black consoles on black TVs on pedestals, and and you step down into it, so it was almost like going into a little lair.
And it seems such a natural thing to do, to bring video gaming into a club environment.
PlayStation really made gaming cool.
This cemented the link not only between youth culture at the time and PlayStation as a brand, but also between PlayStation and rave music in general. And no game forged this bond quite as much as Wipeout. This was the whole package. Cool anti-gravity racing that was technically stunning at the time. The stylisation of the game was handled by an outside company called Designers Republic, who gave the game its futuristic look and branding. And finally, the music, which was consisting of real artists from the rave scene. This was big. We'd all heard of these groups, and to have real songs in a video game was brand new to people, and just furthered the idea that we'd come a long way from the simple days of 16-bit, and now gaming had started to mature. Sony managed to pull the same trick again, but bigger, with the sequel Wipeout 2097. This time, Sony managed to cram 2 major youth trends into the game. The biggest was by including one of the biggest hit songs at the time, Firestarter by The Prodigy. The second was including very prominent advertising for a new drink that just hit the UK scene, a magical beverage that could actually give you energy, called Red Bull. By this point, the mainstream culture was well aware of the PlayStation as not only a games console, but as a brand in general. Then one game came out where it pushed it from recognised brand to culturally significant. You cannot overstate how much of a big deal Tomb Raider and Lara Croft was back in the day. The games sold like hot John on a stick, and Lara herself became the first virtual pin-up girl. She was everywhere. Culture magazines, lads mags, even TV adverts for soft drinks and cars. Here was a global superstar, not from the world of music, film or TV, but from video games, specifically PlayStation. Yes, Tomb Raider was actually out first on the Saturn, but no one was buying or playing it there. It was all about the PlayStation games, and all eyes were on Sony's console. Sega were still in the market with the Saturn, but that was basically a niche enthusiast product by this point. Nintendo had it a bit better with the N64, but next to the Sony juggernaut, they were getting the leftover scraps from the PlayStation banquet. Sony had all the third-party companies on board. They had almost all of the customers, and even though it was pretty much a monopoly at this point, players did actually get a benefit. With all the players using just one machine instead of being split over 3 different brands, companies big and small could be confident in releasing small and more unusual games and have them still find an audience. Games like Parappa the Rapper, Rib Ribbon and Incredible Crisis could quite happily live alongside games like Tekken, F1 and Track and Field, but something no one saw coming was the sudden mainstream success of a long-running niche genre of games, and this sudden explosive growth was driven by a single release. Final Fantasy VII popularised RPGs in the West. There is absolutely no debate about that. Games like Dragon Quest, Phantasy Star and Secret of Mana had an audience, but it's nothing compared to the size of the amount of players enjoying something like fighting games. The release of Final Fantasy VII completely changed that, selling 9.9 million units worldwide. All of a sudden, people that had never touched an RPG were now 30 hours deep, grinding levels and theory crafting materia builds. Final Fantasy had become a huge household name, spawning yet more sequels and spin-off games like Final Fantasy Tactics. This tide of new players to the genre brought a record number of eyes to other RPG games on the PlayStation like Vagrant Story, Vandal Hearts or the excellent Suikoden. Another game that completely reinvigorated a genre, and the only PS1 game to sell more units than Final Fantasy VII, was Gran Turismo. How absolutely huge this game was cannot be overstated. For a start, it was the best-selling game on the system, and its sequel was the 3rd bestseller. But it was a cultural phenomenon too. Hit band at the time, the Cardigans, decided to name their new album Gran Turismo, with their lead single being called My Favourite Game, which featured the band's lead singer driving recklessly down a highway. But lots of games found huge success on the PS1. Games that would seemingly come out of nowhere, sell gangbusters, then turn into juggernaut IPs. And when I say a lot, From games that went big to the console turning small, and this is the point where we talk about the PS1. We all know what this is. It's a redesigned PlayStation that's smaller and probably cheaper to produce. Nothing new here. This has already been done with the Sega Master System and later the Sega Mega Drive. But that's only half of what's going on here, because you also had this little plug-in screen, and the two had clearly been designed together in tandem. At the time, we just thought it was a cool thing that Sony had made, but now in retrospect, what on earth was Sony doing here? It's not like this was portable in any way, because it still needed a power connection. There was no battery pack or anything like that, but actually this was designed to be mounted into a car to coincide with the whole tuner scene thing going on at the time. What started in Japan in the early 90s soon spread globally, and the idea of body kits and aftermarket spoilers and deafening stereo systems became a mainstream youth pastime. Fujitsu and Sega had already produced in-car versions of their systems as Japanese-only products in the mid-90s, but Sony waited until the tuner scene was global before launching their system to users to pimp their rides with, so to speak. Sony released the PS1 combo pack with the tuner scene in mind. It was a PS1, the screen attachment, and a lighter socket power lead to get this up and running in your car straight away. It was a fairly popular console redesign, even though it was released around the same time as another rather large Sony device.
Now is the time. Now is the time.
The level of hype around the PlayStation 2 was unimaginable. Seriously, unless you were there, you really cannot grasp just how rabid people were for this machine. Remember, the hype alone was enough to put Sega out of the hardware business. Just think about this. The Sega Dreamcast was out a full year before the PS2. It had online gaming out the box, and the games lineup, well, it was completely unmatched.
Understand the concept of love. Understand the concept of love. Understand the concept of love.
Then the PS2 comes out a year later, no online gaming, costs more money, has a crap launch game lineup, and it decimated the Dreamcast in sales numbers. But hold on, let's clear up something, a misconception that gets repeated over and over again on the internet. If you take the words of the mouth breathers online, then you'd be led to believe that the PS2 launch lineup was rubbish. But what would children on Reddit and 30-year-old YouTubers with cat ear headphones know about a console launch that was almost 25 years ago?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
They didn't experience it firsthand, and they only have what is written in magazines and ancient internet forums at the time to go on. And here's where it goes wrong. Most of what gets referenced is from the Japanese launch, but the Japanese PS2 launch games were mainly tailored towards the Japanese market. A-Train 6 is a train line building game because the Japanese love trains, but it's also a very text-heavy game, so if you can't read Japanese, you've had it. Drum Mania and Stepping Selection are Japanese rhythm action games, so it's great if you want to Doki Doki Dance, not so much if you don't. Eternal Ring is a From Software RPG, but it's also unplayable if you can't read Japanese. Kessen, another unplayable game if you can't read Japanese. And no one outside Japan watches shogi and mahjong games, so those are out too. So what you're left with is Street Fighter EX3 and Ridge Racer 5, which are both great games anywhere in the world, but it's easy to see why people who imported the system felt like the launch lineup wasn't that great. So people these days that reference those early importer viewpoints are completely missing what the actual actual official Western launch was like. Because here in the UK, we had all of these on launch day: Dynasty Warriors 2, Fantavision, FIFA 2001, Gradius 3 and 4, International Superstar Soccer, Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2, Ridge Racer 5, SSX, Tekken Tag Tournament and Time Splitters. That's 10 great games right there. There was also another 6 outside of these were actually a bit crap, but still, if 10 games is not enough for you on launch day, I don't know what to say to you. But great games were not the only reason to buy a PS2 in the year 2000. There was another giant system selling feature. Here's a TV advert from that year.
A big catalogue sale. Join the DVD revolution with a Samsung DVD player for an amazing $599. Save $200. Buy now on 24 months interest-free terms. Conditions apply. See store for details. The big catalogue sale on Howard Juniorist Harvey Norman.
People were beginning to change from VHS tapes to DVD discs because they were better in every single way. But the players were how much again?
$599.
And how much was a PlayStation 2 from Sony? That's right, $299. The PlayStation 2 was not only a DVD player from respected electronics manufacturer Sony, it's also the cheapest DVD player on the market, and it was the latest video game console. So if you were in the market for a DVD player, you'd be a fool not to buy a PS2. But maybe like me, you lived through all this at the time, so here's a blast from the past just for you. Those damn SCART leads that required you to switch from game mode to DVD mode every time you wanted to watch a movie. Thank God for global TV standards now. Anyway, it wasn't just watching The Matrix on DVD that was the draw here, it was also the games, and arguably the game that was the first to really show what the PS2 could do was Metal Gear Solid 2, and at E3 2000, gamers got their first look at the game and were stunned by its quality. But this was just the start of the flood of quality titles that would hit the system. The PS2 was where many huge IPs began life, and probably why the console was remembered for having such an original quality lineup of heavy hitters. I mean, just look at some of the IPs that were born on the PS2. God of War, Jak and Daxter, Kingdom Hearts, Devil May Cry, Katamari Damacy, Ratchet & Clank, Sly Cooper, Guitar Hero and Yakuza. But let's also not forget the super effective casual gamer bait that worked out so well for Sony. You had the iToy, which had us all dancing around like we were epilepsy victims at a rave. There was also the Buzz controllers, which turned out just to be a vehicle for allowing Jason Donovan into our living rooms. And we finally had SingStar, which solidified the fact that most of us can't actually sing. When it was all said and done, the PS2 ended up being the highest selling console of all time, although I suspect some of that is down to people buying it early as a DVD player and not a games machine. But who's to say? I mean, maybe some people only bought it as a DVD player at first, but then later on heard about games like GTA 3. During this era, the PS2 was not the only PlayStation hardware on the market. You also had the very successful PlayStation Portable, which was capable of producing graphics somewhere between the quality of PS1 and PS2. Sony also sold UMD movies for the PSP, which people bought and then within a week returned for store credit because no one wants to watch a movie like that.
Once it's in, I love it.
The PSP was also the introduction of the XMB cross-media bar interface, as well as the media center functionality. Well, in the UK it was, but not in Japan, because they had a PlayStation called the PSX, which is actually the first Sony machine in the world to use the XMB and have media center functionality. I know this because I actually have one. You want to see it running? Of course you do. So, this is my PSX hooked up to my Elgato capture card. And as you can see, the XMB is pretty much the same thing as it is on the PSP, and it features all the media center features like pictures, videos and music that you'd find on the PSP, as well as what you'd find on the next Sony system. The final system created by Ken Kutaragi and the last PlayStation home console in the original trilogy was the mighty PlayStation 3. Now, compared to every other PlayStation home console, we didn't have to wait long for this one to come out after the Japanese release date. I got mine on launch day, which was March the 23rd, 2007, for a buttock-tightening £425. Well, actually, it was £525 because I bought Virtua Fighter 5 and MotorStorm with it as well, but whichever way you cut it, it was a lot of money. But here's the thing, I had an Xbox 360 at the time and I felt like I was paying out the arse for it. You buy the console, but the controller takes AA Duracell, so you have to buy the plug and charge kit. And unless you want to run a cable from wherever your modem is to whichever room your Xbox is in, you're going to have to buy the wireless adapter. Then the console only comes with a shitty composite lead, so to have it actually output in HD, you're going to have to buy either the VGA lead or the HD component lead. Then you have to pay for online gaming, and if you want to watch a HD movie, now that you've got this HD console and your HD TV, then you've got to pay out even more money. And if you did buy all that shit, which is way more than the PS3 was, the PS3 had more USB ports, a bigger hard drive, memory stick ports so you could transfer your digital camera photos easily and copy stuff over to your PSP. It was backwards compatible with all your old PlayStation games, and because it actually had HDMI built in, which the Xbox did not, the picture quality was far higher. I was already 2 accessories deep and desperately wanted Virtua Fighter 5. So I blew off the Xbox and jumped ship to the PS3 and I played those games to death. Now, I was 26 years old when the PlayStation 3 came out, so I had a digital camera. I had a nice size HD TV and a PSP, and it really felt like the PS3 tied all these things together. And I think that was by design, as Sony had this as a point in their early promotions. So I could rip a CD to the PS3, transfer those files to my PSP, and then use that as an MP3 player. When I went out to Japan, I took photos on my digital camera. When I got back home, I popped the memory card out of the camera into the PS3 so I could bore my friends with pictures of my trip. In later years, I got the Play TV box that turned my PS3 into a digital video recorder so I could record TV shows straight onto the PS3 hard drive. Like the time Rage Against the Machine was the Christmas #1 song. But the one application you never hear people mention is the one called Ad Hoc Party. This one turned your PS3 into a multiplayer game finder for your PSP. So lots of PSP games were multiplayer, but required the PSPs to be within a few meters of each other for direct wireless link-up. Ad Hoc Party made the PS3 act like a go-between, so you could play the same multiplayer PSP games, but now all the players could be in their separate houses so long as they were close to their PS3 consoles. It had a cool menu system where you could find lobbies of people playing the game you want and set up a party. The reality was this became the Monster Hunter portable multiplayer app, although sometimes you might see a game of Wipeout or Ridge Racer going on. But I played more than just PSP games on my PS3, I also played PS1 games on it as well. Not only could you play your actual PS1 discs on the PS3, you could even transfer your save files over from your old memory cards with the USB adapter. But I also bought a lot of digital PS1 games from the PlayStation store. But the problem with buying UK versions is that they were in the original 50Hz mode, so they ran slower. Not only that, if you went to the home menu and looked up the software manual, you'll get these crappy, boring pages of just text which was rubbish. Whereas if you bought your digital games from the American or Japanese stores, the software manuals they had with those games were scans to the original books. Honestly, we got right knocked over here in the UK over that shit.
I'm inclined to agree with you, Dodgy Kebab.
As an owner of a launch PS3 model, mine could play PS2 games, but it didn't play them as well as what the Japanese or American PS3s did. This is because those two both had the full PS2 hardware built onto the PS3's motherboard. The UK model only had the CPU from the PlayStation 2 included. The GPU from the PS2 was actually done through software emulation, so although most games worked fine, every so often you'd find one that didn't work or one that loaded but was proper messed up. But at least you could bring over your old PS2 save files, right? And before I forget, you could even play PS3 games on your PlayStation 3. So that made it the first console since the Mega Drive to be able to play 3 separate generations of games on one machine. And the PS3 had some fantastic games on it. Oh, you want me to explain the Mega Drive thing real quick, yeah? Well, if you had a Japanese Mega Drive, obviously you could play Mega Drive games on it. If you had the Mega adapter, you could play Master System games on it, as well as SG-1000 games, which was the generation before the Master System. Anyway, I was talking about PS3 games, and this really was the era that Sony started setting its flag down that PlayStation was all about high quality first party games and system exclusives. They'd lost ground in the console war to Microsoft, so they came up with a winning strategy of just releasing a flood of great games. It was just title after title of utter bangers, and soon enough they once again pulled ahead of Microsoft and have been miles ahead of them ever since. Strangely, Microsoft have never adopted the strategy of make good games for your game machine and have continued to release utter dross, even though both Sony and Nintendo have shown that it's definitely a winner. Oh well, soon enough the console war will be over and it'll be like in the old days, but instead of Sega versus Nintendo, it'll be Sony versus Nintendo. But the PS3 not only had great games, a Blu-ray player, superb media functions, it also offered totally free online gaming, which you can still play even now. But if the game you want to play was shut down, then just change the DNS settings on your console, then check out the PS1 service. Then you can get back into Home, SOCOM and even Warhawk. But to wrap this up, the PS3, especially in retrospect, feels like the bridge between what PlayStation was and what PlayStation is today. The first half of its life felt like a Ken Kutaragi box of chaos, a piece of Japanese tech that was way ahead of its time, paired with crazy new games and a lot of Japanese-only import titles that would simply not fly in the Western market. But once the redesigned PS3 Slim happened, the exotic tech was pared back and Sony became focused on mass-market blockbuster titles. It truly felt like Ken Kutaragi had left the building, which he had. And this is where we are still today with the PS4 and PS5. It feels like this is a different PlayStation to what we had 30 years ago. But if I look past my own feelings and take in the reality of what is actually happening, nothing's really changed. We are still getting exclusive Sony games, most of which are huge blockbusters, but some are smaller scale games which are also popular. Some are smaller games which are not so popular. Third-party studios are still making giant games which sell gangbusters. They also make decent games for a niche audience. We still get utter rubbish which isn't worth your time, and we still get unbelievable games that totally fly under the radar. We still get indie games made by small studios, and we get titles that are so different it's hard to categorise them. Anyone that says Sony had a bad 2024, go and look at the console exclusives from this year, because if that is a bad year, what on earth does a good year look like? And it's not just Sony doing well, Nintendo are too. In fact, there's more current generation consoles in the hands of players than any generation ever, and both Sony and Nintendo are doing huge numbers every single month. So to the doommongers who say console gaming is dying and the industry's into trouble, I'm sorry, but you don't know what you're talking about, and the numbers speak for themselves. PlayStation is alive and well and shows no sign of going anywhere. The future is hard to predict, but there's one thing we know for certain, and that's that AI is here to stay, and we're starting to see the future path of what it's going to offer. That's image quality. PSSR in the PlayStation 5 Pro is basically a blueprint for the future. AI can upscale an image quality without the need for expensive graphic cards found in high-end PCs, as well as improve frame rates with AI frame generation. We have this tech right now, and it's only going to improve in time, and given the rapid speed that AI is already improving, we're not going to have to wait that long. This begs the question, what's the point in PCs with graphics cards that cost thousands of pounds when a console equipped with AI tech can just reproduce an image that looks the same? Well, the answer is that you won't have to buy a PC for gaming anymore. This brings me to my future prediction. PC gaming is in trouble. Right now, PC gaming is enjoying a boom thanks to the perceived idea that only a high-spec PC can offer the best-looking games. But what happens when PlayStation 6 comes out with AI tech? that can offer the same visual quality as a top-range NVIDIA graphics card. A console will always be cheaper than a PC because of the subsidised nature of the business, and when AI becomes so good you can't tell the difference between a PC and a PlayStation 6, the battle then becomes down to price, and in that respect, PC can never hope to compete with a console. I know this sounds crazy to say that the PC gaming market is about to face serious trouble, but I can't see a reason to game on a PC when we get to the point that console AI tech makes the graphics appear identical. When people say the future of console game is in trouble, I don't see it. In fact, I see the exact opposite. It's actually PC gaming that's in trouble. But you never know, we'll see. Oh, I didn't mention the Vita or the Pocket Station!
ビデオにコメントを残して、いいねボタンを押し、友達に勧めてから、ドッジケバブを購読してください。